Okay, now, as someone drawn to historical and biographical details, I came across a chronologically intriguing Agadata concerning the Tanur Behuda ben Beseira here in the Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin. Keep in mind that the Bnei Beseira is a famous family. That's Hillel and the Bnei Beseira. You remember that story, right? Where that's how Hillel became famous. That Erev Pesach falling out on Saturday and so on and so forth. And before that, they used to do the Kiddush HaChodesh. That's the reason why nobody knew what happened, what to do, because they always arranged in such a way that Erev Pesach would not be on a Saturday, and so on and so forth. It's a lot of individual book, exactly what you told them in the reconstruction of the Doros Rishonim. Now, there's a famous story of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira in the first parak of Pesachim. One of the things I remember, and you will too, where it says, again, I say, repeat, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, where a guy went and said, I sneaked into Beis HaMikdash and I ate the Karm Pesach. And he said, did you eat the aliyah? Did you eat the tail? No. Oh, next time ask for the tail. And when he went next time, he asked for the tail. They said, well, who are you? And they found out who he is and they killed him. Right? So, and they wrote a letter, a famous letter to Yehuda ben Beseira, Ashrech Yehuda ben Beseira, something like that you were in Nitzivin, Sudaska Prus al Yushalayim. So it means that he lived in Nitzivin, which is exactly where the ISIS is located, on the Turkish Nesibis, right, on the Turkish Syrian border, over there not far from the Euphrates River. That's the ground zero of the ISIS. It's about 10 miles north of the Turkish border. And that's far away from Israel. And this guy, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, knows it was a Tana, and he was one of those Tana that had a yeshiva far away in Chutz La'aretz. It's not often, but you had some. There's a famous Tosfos that says, how come he didn't go on to Pesach? You know, why didn't he bring the Karm Pesach over? He's telling somebody else what to do over there. And Tosfos says, because he didn't own any land, right? In order to, I just remember this. In order to be chayav, to bring a Karm Pesach, you have to be a landowner in Israel. So there's a famous kasha, the Tosfos says in Kedushin, every Jew owns Dal Amos in Eretz Israel. So the answer, they say, the Vilna Gaon says, it's very famous, that there's a story about the dry bones. And there's a question in Bavli Pesach, in Sanhedrin. And the question is, did the dry bones really happen, or is it a mashal? And some say it's a mashal. And the Rambam says, for example, it's a mashal. Surprise, surprise. But the story is, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira got up and said, it's not a mashal. I'm wearing the tefillin for my great-grandfather, who was one of these guys. Right? So, the Vilna Gaon, they say, you see, he was descended from the Bnei Ephraim, because that's where they say the dry bones were. The people left Egypt early and got killed. They didn't wait for Moshe's time, and therefore they didn't have Dal Amos in Eretz Israel, because only the Jews who made it to Israel got it to Israel, and he's talking descended from one who did. That's a famous part. Now, obviously, the story I just told you means that Yehuda ben Beseira lived in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, because he's talking to somebody about eating the tail and so forth of the Karm Pesach, literally. Okay? On the other hand, there's a Yerushalmi here. There's a remarkable story about Yehuda ben Beseira that seems to have taken place after Karm Beis HaMikdash. And that's the Agadata I wanted to share with you. And make it easier, I'm going to do it to our scope. And it says, Dilma, which, Dolma, no. It's the Yerushalmi, not the Bavli. Then you got to watch out.
Dolma?
Listen, Dolma means Hahu Maisa. It's not what you think. It's not another form of Dilma. There are certain words unique to the Yerushalmi. You know? So, there was a story. Rabbi Lezer Bishur ben Gamliel Salki the Romi. Rabbi Lezer Bishur and Rabbi Gamliel went to Rome. Alam L'chad Asar. They were looking for a Jewish neighbor. They went to a certain place. Bashkan Mianaikia Avdin Gavshushan. They saw children making piles of dirt, like a sandbox. This is a very famous story in the Saul Lieberman literature. He used to quote this a lot. For Amr and Hochen and the kids, when they're playing in the sandbox, said as follows: Bnei Ard Yisrael Avdin, the Bnei Yisrael do as follows with their produce. Hain Truma Hain Meiser. So they separated the sand like a tenth, you know, and they said this will be Meiser, this will be Meiser Sheni, and a little sand for Truma, and so it's also a Jewish neighborhood. That's the famous story how they found a Jewish neighborhood. Right? Amrin Staber the Hochen Yehudaim. So they found a place in the city of Rome what seems to be a Jewish neighborhood. Okay? All Nechadasar, they entered the place. Kalbun Bechad, and they were received as guests in somebody's house. When they sat down to eat, what the host did was, every dish that was brought to them, before that, they wouldn't bring it out until first they brought it into the room on the side there, like a bedroom, and they took it in there for a minute or two, and then they brought it out to eat. Otherwise, one brought before them. So they started saying, maybe it's a kishuv. The household gods. After all, it's Rome. So that's what I just said. So they said to the host, "My iskach, what's pshat? The kol tavshel l'maisi, the at maisi kaminon, at islay at mile kituna reisat mal kaman, that you won't bring it to us until you take it in that room first." So the host said, no. Our grandfather is in that room. Okay? Chad Abba Gab, I have an elderly father there. He made a vow that he will never leave that bedroom until he sees Chachamim from Eretz Yisrael. Right? So, out of respect for him, I bring the food first to him, right, to allow him to take his portion first. Keep it up, mate. Amalei, they said, Zil b'amarlei inan hachim. You got some rabbis from Eretz Yisrael, you can come out of the room. Nafik came out there. They said, what's pshat? Why are you insisting on seeing us? Amalam, Salun al Bridal Amali. Pray for my son, because he didn't have my children. Amalei Relezer Yeshua. So Relezer to Yeshua. Yeshua apparently was an expert in kishuv, that sort of thing. Ma Yeshua ben Chanadia. Chami ma David. What can you do to handle this case? The guy should have a baby. Amalon, I actually started the kisa. So it's a strange story. So Yeshua said, bring me some flax seed. For Iceland, he's their kid, and they brought him. He did something, but it looked like he was planting it on the table, because he knew all the kishuv. It appeared as though he was sprinkling it with water. Ischami the sulcus, and it looked like it grew on the table. Ischami mislashleg, it appeared that he harvested it, so he grew to flax and he harvested it. Until he brought up a woman prominent braids of hair. This was the witch involved, who was causing all the trouble. Cast a spell on the guy, he didn't have any children. This is the sorceress who cast a spell on the pregnant having children. Amarli, Yeshua said to her, undo what you did. Amarli, Lina Shari, I will not undo it. Amarli, Locain, if you don't do what I just told you, I'm going to fire, I'll publicize what you're doing. You'll get into trouble. Amarle, she said, Li no Yochab, I'm unable to do it. Edom locked in Biyama, because the object I used to cast the spell was thrown into the sea. Because of Yeshua Sardiyama, Yeshua called in Pluto, right? The ruler, Neptune, and he said, Yeshua said, the angel of the sea, Paltum, and the sea spit out the object, and then she undid the spell. But Sal in the lake, and then they dived for this childless guy. And the baby was born was a Yehudim Seirah. Right? This apparently I found later on. Tosim Menocha said, "Oh yeah, everybody knows this story." Right? Amru ilu alinu lakana lahami sadikazeh leinu. Right? This visit was worth it, producing Yehudim Seirah. Now my point is like this: based on what I just told you, there's a whole thing of history, like the Durr Shem and all this, that there are two Yehudim Seirahs. This is like such a thing like that. Okay, it seems to be after the Korban, but just that, right? The blessed from Yeshua visiting Rome. But when do we have records constantly of the first generation of turning visiting Rome after the Korban Beis Hamikdash, when they're always going to Rome to propitiate the government, to appeal to Caesar? There are many of these stories. The Margal Siyam on Sanhedrin says there was this second Rabbi Yehuda Seir who had the Zaydis to fill in. Okay, not the first Rabbi Yehuda Seir, because he had emotional gratitude for securing his birth. In other words, this Zaydi who was in the room was the dry bones guy. Right? That's as Margaret suggests that. So, but if they're all related, it doesn't matter. Because anyway, they all come from these Ephraimites, the Bnei Beseira family. That's the point. What is interesting is the parallel between the dry bones coming to life on the one hand and the impotent or infertile descendant due to magic who nevertheless ended up following a son who became a girl who did not live in Israel like the Ephraimites who never got to Israel. All right? Both Yehuda Beseira the first and the second were Marbit's Torah in Chutz La'aretz, and it's even their yeshiva was so elite that even the leading Israeli Amoraim wanted to learn there. Right? It says, Meister Belazar Rabbi Shemua, Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, Rabbi Yochanan. Shal Hochel and Etzivin, Eitz Rabbi Yehuda Beseira Loman Hamer Torah. And at the last minute they stop. Higil Etzidam, Zochos Eretz Yisrael, Zokri Anim, Zolgam and Demos, Makar Bigdam. They said, we can't leave Israel. But they got to the border and they said, we can't do this. Makar Mikrazeh, he reached the Mosav, he Shavtim, Baratzam, Chazu Bar Lehem, the Mekomam, Amr Yeshiva Eretz Yisrael, Shkol, Komitz, the Torah. But they wanted to go there, right? They wanted to go there. Ari Levin's son, that'd be Lali's grandfather. Yeah, grandfather. Ari even lived in Yerushalayim. His son is Chaim Yaakov. He sent him in the 30s to learn by Baruch Ber and Kamenetz. So from Yerushalayim, right? Why? Because of Baruch Ber. So my point's like this: Rabbi Yehuda Beseira was obviously something. Okay, so he was born in Chutz La'aretz. He lived in Chutz La'aretz. Had a yeshiva and a base in there. So chashuv that the Brisa says, "Toner Rabbanan Tzedek Tzedek Tirdav Halich Achrei Chacham LiYeshiva." Go to base in chashuv. Lezer Lelud, Achor Rabbi Yochanan Zakal Berchayo, Rabbi Shul Lepekin, Rabbi Gilul Liyavne, Rabbi Kiva Bnei Brak, Nasi Romi, Chaim Ben Trel Lesichni, and Achor Yehuda Beseira L'Nefsivin. So he had a renowned Jewish situation there, although he wasn't in Israel. So he was connected to the Torah Chutz La'aretz, right? Which his history showed that's one part of the Torah. How much of the Torah literature is composed in Israel, and how much is composed in Chutz La'aretz? Obviously, it's meant to be that way. We have a Talmud Yerushalmi, we have a Talmud Bavli. It's funny that we all follow the Torah stuff that was put together in Chutz La'aretz. That's just what it is. Now, what's interesting in this regard is that although Yehuda Beseira was a Chutz La'aretz person, he was committed to the subordination of Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, which is the famous story of Chanan ben Achi Yeshua. And I'll just tell you out loud, it's in Yerushalmi and Nedarim, but due to Roman persecution, there was a time when it wasn't possible for the basin to make the new moon. And so they went outside of Israel to do it, including one of the big rabbis, Chanan ben Achi Yeshua. And once he was in Chutz La'aretz, he kept up doing it. After a while, the persecution ceased, and the rabbis in Israel said, hand it back to us, because really it should be done in Israel. And he didn't want to do it. And the story is, I think I could read it, but I'll just make it faster. The story is they sent this rabbi and that rabbi, and said, I know these guys, they don't know how to learn. I can kill them in learning, which was true. Which was true. And they had a dramatic scene where they said, okay, Kimi Babel takes Yisoro, Dvar Hashem, Menetziv. No. Kimi Tzion takes it. Well, if you hold Kimi Tzion takes Yisoro, then hand it back. So he wouldn't do it. So he said, eventually he said, the only guy I trust is Rabbi Yehuda Beseira. Because he's in Chutz La'aretz and so he'll understand the situation. Especially understand levels of learning. And Rabbi Yehuda Beseira say, you are bigger than him in learning, but nevertheless, Achareim. Right? And he wouldn't even give him the hand. So Rabbi Yehuda Beseira, the story is, went around from town to town as far as he could and told everybody, this year Rosh Hashanah is on Wednesday, it's not on Tuesday. Pesach goes on this day, not on this day. The same thing, of course, happened in the 10th century for a while with Sadi Gon and Aaron Ben Meir, who was the big Rosh Hashiva in Eretz Yisrael. And Sadi Gon, by that time, they had the calendar that you and I use. And so Pesach, let's say, for example, was Tuesday, and this guy said, no, it's Monday. And, the whole Turam came out that he did not prevail. In the story I'm talking about, Eretz Yisrael prevailed, and this position of Chanei Achi Yeshua was undermined because of Yehuda Beseira. So notice he lived in Chutz La'aretz, but he was subordinating, right? He lived in Chutz La'aretz, but he's committed to subordination of Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, and you can't get a more vivid example of that than the calendar. Okay, now I repeat, everybody agreed in the story that the rabbi in Chutz La'aretz, Chanim ben Achishu, was a bigger learner, right? But it doesn't matter, because Israel has an exclusive on that when the situation arises. Now, why did this second Rabbi Yehuda ben Sarah distinguish himself in this pro-Israel activity? Well, the first Rabbi Yehuda ben Sarah didn't. I mean, there's no evidence of this. He was in the Sivan, and his net extended to Jerusalem. That's what they said in the story of Pesachim. That's all we know. It seems that the first one never did go to Korban Pesach, even though many did. I remember Philo describes in one of his books huge caravans that used to come from Bavel to Israel for Pesach, bringing a ton of money and things like that. They passed right by the Sibir, if you know the route. So for some reason they didn't go, right? But the second guy, the second Rebbe there, obviously was Mr. Eretz Yisrael. Now the mystical answer, I think, lies in the story of his birth that I just related to you. What did the grandfather say? He wouldn't eat until he saw Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, until he saw rabbis from Israel. Not Jewish rabbis, Chachmei Yisrael, Chachamim from Eretz Yisrael. It's interesting, right? Which Rabbi Lezer and Yeshua obviously were. Why this emphasis on he has to see Chacham from Eretz Yisrael? There are plenty of big people outside of Eretz Yisrael. If he lived in Rome, you had Rabbi Moshe ben Cherish and things like that. I think the answer is the famous proto-Zionist Vart of the Netziv. At least that's what they say about the Malpilim. This I heard from Rabbi Bach long ago. I think it's brilliantly meduyuk, as you'll hear in a second. Let me explain. In fact, let the words of the Brisa speak for themselves. I think you'll like this. This is in Sanhedrin 96. Ton Rabbanan, Mikoshe said Slavchad. Who was the Mikoshe Sheitzin? The guy who was Michal Shabbos? Doesn't say his name. So it says, I'll tell you, it was Slavchad. V'cheinu Omer, V'yibnei Yisrael b'midbar, Lo Mavina Meis b'midbar, Malahan Slavchad, Som Divi Rabbi Kiva. So Rabbi Kiva gave away this classified information. Now listen to this. Amar li Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Akiva, also atalitin sadin. Right? Akiva, you did something bad. Right? You have to pay for this one day. In Kidvarecha, Torah Kisasa Atamagalo. So if the Torah doesn't tell you who the Mekoshish is, you want to keep it confidential. Why are you telling on it? And if you're wrong, and he wasn't identical with the Mekoshish, then you maligned someone. Okay? You libeled him. What about the Geographic? He's not going to Geographic. So then the Gemara goes, Rabbi Kiva like this. Okay, he wasn't from the Slavchad. Who was he? Me'apilos, from the Ma'apilim. People wanted to get into Israel right after the Meralim. And, Moshe said, don't go, and they got killed on the way. Now, the famous question, then you're telling who he was. Look at the protagonists. Rabbi Akiva on the one hand, and our hero, the second Rabbi Yehuda ben Sarah on the other. Look how our hero blessed Rabbi Akiva for saying that Slavchad was the Mekoshish, but he does not blast him for saying that he was one of the Mapilim, one of the people who tried to get in Israel early. Now, the Netziv on his own is famously supposed to have said, as a card-carrying member of the Chovevei Tzion, so from here we see Mapilim is not so bad. Let's be ashamed of. Right? It's not a black mark. Mekoshish is a black mark. Mapilim is not a black mark. Certainly nothing to be ashamed of. But I want to say better, if I can so humbly suggest. The protagonist was the second Yehuda ben Beseira, who was descended from Mapilim, from the Ephraimites. Okay? The original Mapilim. In other words, Rabbi Akiva gave him a zinger retort. Right? Now, really, we can do better. We can do better than read it as a zinger retort. We can read it deeper than that. Rabbi Akiva knew who Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira was. He knew he was the guy who still wore his ancestors' tefillin from the Ephraimites, which bespoke deep identification with his origins. I mean, who wears his grandfather's tefillin? Great-grandfather's tefillin. As we saw in Margos Yom, if we want to be mystical, we could say this was his Shorish Neshama. True, the Ephraimites sinned in leaving early, but it was a sin which came from a good place, the natural attraction to Eretz Yisrael. In other words, they're plain regular sins, where the Eitzar entices the person to just do it. Cross the line, they'd be Michal Shabbos. Cross the line, be Eiffel Trefus. That's one kind of sin. Then there's another kind of sin, where one is led to sin by the Eitzar justifying it as a mitzvah. Right? Shua Silverberg told me a story in Israel, I think it was, He was in some place near Rehoboth on some stiebel, and somebody did something the other guy didn't like. I don't remember what it was anymore. And the guy ranked him out, screamed at him publicly, and afterwards, the people in the shul said to the guy who ranked him out, said, "What do you think the Chazon would have done?" And such, "Punkt vich." Well, that's what I did, which is blunt, but that's Yetzer Hara justifying it. Right? It's right for you to go and scream at the other guy. So in English, we call this misguided idealism. In this case, the sinner erred, but he was not a rebel against divine law. Right? It was a mistake, and the Ephraimites got killed, but didn't mean it. In their mind, they didn't mean it as a rebellion. I don't know if you're Sabbatian about this, but the sin contained a certain tov. And it seems that the Bnei Beseira family interpreted the miraculous resurrection of the dry bones, which is not a mashal. Here Beseira says, "This is my grandfather."
Don't we say the same thing about Slough, though?
Hold on. As indicating, with apologies to Mark Antony, that the evil was interred with their bones, but subsequently the good lived on after them, or better yet, the good brought them back to life, literally. Right? Knowing that this very Messias, literally, Yehuda Beseira, was Hapala, Mapilim, Rabbi Akiva identified Slavchad as one of the Mapilim. Right? Knowing that it would resonate with Yehuda Beseira, it certainly would explain why Chazal say that the Benos Slavchad Chibabu Sa'aretz. Right? Because the Jews said, we want to go back to Egypt. This is so Jewish. And all of a sudden, Benos said, well, yes, we wanted real estate. As soon as they heard that, everybody said, I want to buy. That happened. Right? And the Mishnah says that they actually did real estate sharks. They got 3-4 portions. You know, as soon as they heard, I want to buy that house on Tati, everybody wouldn't buy the house on Tati. Right? Because they had that inner natural connection with Israel. Switching from history is reflected through the Haggadah. Just want to look at history reflected through the lens of the Gemara or Iyun. And here we bring the Avodas Levi. Right? I saw that Levi's brought down a certain connection, naturally it caught my eye. Especially when it involves an interchange, an exchange of letters between the young Rabbi Ruderman and the Eim Abnei Smecha Teichtal, Rabbi Yisachar Teichtal. Because the Eim Abnei Smecha's Teichtal lived in Slovakia, Rabbi Ruderman lived in Lithuania. But when he had his first and only child, apparently it was a very bad birth, medically. And she had to go for a long recuperation in a sanitarium, where you get better. And I forget, sanitarium. One's for crazy people, one's to get better. This is the one to get better. And I don't know why, but Pieszczany in Slovakia was a very famous health spa in the Tatra Mountains. And that's where Eimon Smech was a rabbi there. So you have a Litvak on the one hand. You have a Hungarian Oberlander. He's from Pressburg, but also Hasidic on the other hand. But they really found a common language, if they understood each other's Yiddish. And I'll just tell you this. By the time this exchange of correspondence is over, as a matter of history, Teichtal eventually sent his kids to learn in Slovakia, which is extremely unusual. There was one guy that went to learn, like two brothers. Mark Shapiro long ago published this correspondence, and the son and the father, and the sons of the book says, here they're really learning. But then he got, today's the Lubavitcher, he got Nitfal Chabad, and there was like 1 or 2 Chabad steeples in Kovna, and he drifted to them. And then he died from a blood disease or something very young. It was unfortunate. But it's interesting, this connection. Right? Now, Rabbi Teichtal sent Rabbi Ruderman his Sefer Mishnah Socher. In other words, long before the Eimon Bani Smech, which is happening in the Holocaust, they had a Lumdish thing called Mishnah Socher. Now, apparently it's 2 volumes. This is not the right volume. I didn't know that. And when he sent it to him, Rabbi Ruderman sent back his Ha'aris on the Sefer, and though Ha'aris on the Sefer constitute chapter 23 of Avodas Levi. But that's what it is. And one of these Ha'aris involves a passage from the first paragraph of the Yerushalmi Sanhedrin. This is a classic Bekias thing. And just the one thing I want to discuss this morning, as I said, it involves a certain reconstruction of history, a speculative reconstruction, as Rabbi Ruderman admits, based on Lumdus and Pilpul concerning innocent in the book of Nehemiah, and here we go. In Nehemiah, we have a description of his consecration ceremony, what they call Mosifin al-Ha'ir. How do you add halachically to Jerusalem? A halachic ceremony effecting the expansion of the city limits of Jerusalem. This is a ritual act, as there are halachic rules specific to Yerushalayim, like Ma'aser Sheni and Kach and Kalam and so forth, which may only be eaten in Jerusalem. Okay, define Jerusalem. Literally, what's the city limits? The pasuk says in Nehemiah that they had a ceremony to expand the city. For al sorry Yehuda me'al Choma, v'amin shtei todos gedolas, v'tahaluchos liyamin me'al Choma l'shar ashpa. I put the sorry Yehuda on the wall. I also brought 2 large loaves connected with the carbon toda. The procession then began towards the right on the wall, towards the dung gate. The Mishnah in Shul Sanhedrin described the halacha requirements for such a ceremony to be effective. In Sanhedrin it says, "In Mosifin al Huir v'Azaris al Pi Beisin Shoshim Yechad." One of the things you need is Sanhedrin. In Shavuos it's more extensive, and it says, "Ein Mosifin al Huir v'Azaris el B'Melech Navi or in Betumim Sanhedrin Shoshim Yechad Shtei Todos Shir Ubezim Halchim Shtei Todos Achreim L'Chol Yisrael Achreim Hapanim is Nechelos V'Achitzon in Nisrefes." A whole bunch of requirements, right? Including the 2 large loaves. And one is eaten, one isn't. It sounds like if you don't do it, it doesn't count. That's why we couldn't do it today, for example, right? You couldn't halachically extend the boundaries of Jerusalem, which is one of the reasons there are always fights every year. Where exactly do you read the Megillah on the 14th? On the Toda is the right carbon over here, if you read that Gemara, because it's Kach and Kalam, and to be eaten throughout Jerusalem. So therefore, you want to extend the city of Jerusalem, use a carbon totem. So carrying it in new areas symbolize this. I'm going to omit the technical discussion in Yerushalmi about how you bring new territory, or would that make it possible? Anyway, had they wanted to extend the area of the Heichal, they wouldn't use a totem, they would use a mincha mafi taner, which is the type of thing that you can eat only in that area. Now, the Yerushalmi raises the historical question, where exactly did they get the loaves from? Right, for the carbon totem, at the time of Ezra Nehemiah. Here we deal with the world of Talmudic reconstructions of history. Who conquered Jerusalem? King David. Who halachically sanctified Jerusalem? King Solomon. In the time of King David, there was no temple. Hence, all the halachas about Jerusalem did not kick in. In my opinion, this is why King David was always obsessed with building the temple, as any student of Chronicles 1 is aware. Because God tells David, you can't build a temple. So he draws up the plans, he writes the music, he assembles the choir, he raises the money. It's what I don't forget in the construction business. It's just push a button, right? Whatever you call that, ready to go. He hands it to Shlomo. Turnkey. Yeah, turnkey. Look, exactly. He hands it to Shlomo, and he says, at the end of Divrei Yamal, I've done everything. All you have to do is just, like you say, turn the key. So in this case, commence the construction. A key component. You see, King David wanted to tie his dynasty together with the Jewish religion, which he did. As we know, many challenged the legitimacy of his rule, as claimed to be divinely anointed and recipient of a divine insurance policy, maybe an exclusive, because God said, I won't get rid of your family ever. And if you like the Ramban, nobody else can do it. A key component of the policy was to conquer Yerushalayim, which was decided the Akedah, and make it not only his royal capital, but the religious capital as well, by building a temple there with all the rules of Kach and Bikurim, etc. And when Hashem told him he would not be allowed to build it, he was very upset, and he proceeded to do everything but build it. Accordingly, the Kiddush Halachti not take place until Shlomo, who built the temple. Okay, so the Yerushalmi now says as follows. Shlomo had to sanctify the city. He had to do one of these ceremonies. He also had to do the Beis HaMikdash. We'll put that aside for a second. In order to be Mekadosh to Jerusalem, Shlomo needed, among other things, 2 loaves from the 40 loaves that are part of carbon toda. But there was no Beis HaMikdash yet. Now, this requires slaughtering and offering an animal. But the temple was not yet built at that point. That's what Yerushalmi says. And if there was no temple, where could Shlomo get the Behemas Toda, let's say? The Gemara says, got it from Obama. From Nov and Givon. Nov was wiped out, but the idea is to get it from Obama. The Gemara answers, at that time there's no Isser Bomas. Isser Bomas only came when they built the temple, right? And was up and running. The time we were talking about Bomas were okay, so he got it from over there. What about the second temple? Gemara asks. when Ezra and Nehemiah reconsecrated the city in the ceremony I just described, in that vividly described ceremony. At that time, there was no heter bamas. So where did they get it from? The answer is, if you look closely at the first half of the book of Ezra, they had started doing Correspondence right away. The temple was built out of fear of the Arabs. Vayachim Yoshua ben Tzadok ve'achon HaKohanim, at the beginning of Ezra was Zerubbabel. Vayevnu was Mizbach Hashem Elhei Yisrael, lahal l'sob olos ka'kos b'sarov Moshe Sholim. Right? Ki be'emam aleim me'amei arotzes. They were scared. The guys, so right or wrong, they just said they mizbech and started offering Correspondence. Now, the thing is, this is all based on the assumption that the Kedusha Rishon Kishel Shash B'Kishel Lasi Lava, which means when they had the first Kedusha of Shlomo never lapsed. That's why they could start up the Correspondence as soon as they arrived, even before they rebuilt the temple. But if you hold Kishel Rishon and Kishel Lo Kishel Lasi, if you say the original Kedusha lapsed, how could they do Correspondence? And if you couldn't do once, how could they re-sanctify? Right? This is a famous Rambam who says, now you're familiar with this. The Rambam says, Kedusha Rishon Kishel Lo Kishel Lasi Lava, that the original Kedusha lapsed. So how did they offer? Rambam says these words. How did they offer it in the time of Ezra? He says, I hold mystically that the Kedusha Rishon never departed from the Temple Mount because the Shekhinah is there. Right? This is the basis for the Israeli politics that you don't go to Temple Mount. Right? I just know that. And the Ravid says, Kach nearly me sod Hashem B'reyav, that you're wrong. No, I'm the Kabbalist around here, and there is no Kedusha. Right? Now, anyhow, naturally, so naturally, so what do you do? Now you could answer, they got the answer from a bummer, right? In other words, if the Kedusha Rishon elapsed, then maybe the Bamas can be restored. They had their Bamas. If, when they destroyed the first temple, maybe you went back to being allowed to take it from somewhere else. And they could get a carbon Torah from a Nova and Givon, like we said before, at the first temple. That would be the way to explain the ceremony with loaves at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. All of the above is to give the background for what I call the Teichtal Rudimental Correspondence in the 1920s. Because in Rabbi Teichtal published 2 volumes of his response, I have only the first, Mishnah Sacher, and they were not only big Bekim and Gemara, but across the board, Rishonim, Achronim, we all remember the Rosh Hashiva. And that's exactly what Teichtal was. And in Avodas Levi, chapter 23, says, Parshin Nitzavim, 1928, Slabotka, Amal Zamovik, Harf, Baki, etc., Teichtal, Kibalti, Shnei Asfarim, Mishnah Sacher, Tov Yagel. Tov Yagel is a drushes. Ashekadani Chuaschein, Al Chura Kibbutz says, thank you for the book. Ad Achshav will also be Yodi Lion Bisfar V'Yikarm, B'Yatol Akachli Mod Lion, B'Sefer Mishnah Sacher, Hinimoli Al Gedosa B'Charif is a Bekias, Nifla V'Yikot Eitz Asher, Hinuriyosai, Rayonai, Midei Shoti Bisfar V'Yikarm. Right? I looked through it here in my Haaretz. And one of them is on this Yerushalmi. So I thought that's kind of cute. Okay? So according to the Mishnah Sacher, and this is very charifis, bekiyas. What do you do with the sheet of Chaim Cohen in Tosas? Chaim Cohen apparently says in the famous Gemara Megillah that we all heard about, Kitcher Shon, Shiloh and Nov and all that. According to the sheet of Chaim Cohen in Tosas and Megillah, he says even if you hold Lo Kitcher Lasi Lovo, that the first thing lapsed, the Isra Bamas was still there. It never removed. In other words, once they prohibited Bamas, that's eternal, regardless of what happened later on. So if that's the case, right, as in Nehemiah, where they get the loaves from? They couldn't do a carbon tonal non-sacred karka according to the point of view that it lapsed, okay? And they couldn't do a Bama. So the Kasha Mitzvah is how can Chaim Cohen understand the Isra Bamas was absolute? How would he explain this consecration ceremony, which explicitly included the loaves that was slaughtered and offered animal sacrifice, the carbon Torah? Doesn't it seem that Chaim Cohen is wrong? That's the Kasha in Mishnah Sacher. It's a Kasha in our Yerushalmi, because our Yerushalmi says, Nicha bal yosem in agolo, shekri v'acher chakitshu, bach nasosim l'artz mamei kitshu. I understand what happened in time of Ezra and Nehemiah where they got their animals from, but what did they do in the time of Shlomo? This assumes there was no problem with the animal and the loaves in the time of Ezra, but really was, according to Reb Chaim Cohn. Is this kasha that this 20-something Rabbi Yerudaman, who had a copy in the mail, undertook to our emperor in chapter 23 of Avodas Levi, which I won't read at length. Rabbi Yerudaman reported to the Gemara in Shavuos on the Test of Om Tez Zayin, where the subject of the consecration of Yerushalayim is discussed. The Mishnah said you have to have all these things, B'chol Shalom Nasa, B'chol Eila, Kohen, or Betumim, Sanhedrin. Anichn Zein Chayam Kares. It doesn't count. This indicates that all components are essential to the consecration. The problem, of course, is they weren't all present at the time of Ezra. There's no Urim Betumim, for example, no king. This leads to a machlokes and Amoraim. But what does it mean that these are all essential? Itmer, Rav Huna Amar B'chol Elu Tanan, almost finished. And Rav Nachman Bar Achas Mikol Elu Tanan. One says you need all these elements that don't count, and the other one says no, it's not true. Rav Huna Amar B'chol Elu Tanan Kasar B'kedusha Shon Kitch L'Shad of the Kitch L'Azi Lavo. So the first opinion is that it never lapsed. But Ezra Zecher Ba'almahu David. So why did Ezra do this whole ceremony? Nostalgia, history. Rav Nachman Amar B'achas Mikol Elu Tanan. Rav Nachman says only needs one element. If you have a basin, let's say, for example, or music. Kedusha Shigid Lo Kitch L'Azi, he holds that the Kedusha lapsed. For Ezra Kedusha Kodesh Avlav Tumen. And Ezra could pull it off anyway with one of the elements. Notice, the one who holds that it lapsed is indeed the one who says you don't need all the components of the ceremony, one's enough. The only reason Ezra included the loaves for nostalgia, it was for nostalgia, or maybe even not nostalgia. Rabbi Rudimus brings a ritva that I just saw, where he says, Eino achros ma'akvos, awul mitzvah ve'inu kula dichsi b'chein tasu. So notice the ritva says, there is a mitzvah d'oraisa, just it's not ma'akev if you don't do it. Anyway, it's a nice chop, but it begs the question, how did they get those nostalgic loaves? I mean, if the sanctity lapsed, any carbon was automatically puzzled, no? To try to answer that, it won't be any nostalgia then. Rabbi Rudiman suggests that what happened was as follows. They had a procession, the Kohen Gadol or a Navi, physically led the procession. As soon as they stepped over the area, this affected the consecration of the karka. Following right behind, they slaughtered the animals and offered the newly consecrated, or the new karka. They immediately baked the loaves, right, 40 loaves, and 2 of them followed behind, which must have been an interval, an hour or two, something like that. It's a strange reading of this source, and he says it anyway. He said, I know it's a little strange, but this is my teretz. Okay? This is the teretz. I just want to add one last piece before I conclude. I just saw it a little differently. And this is by way of suggestion. Consider, already at the time of Zerubbabel, they were doing carbonos, as it says in the pasuk, explicitly in the book of Ezra. How could they do that? In other words, long before Ezra and Nehemiah came along. How could, if you hold the sanctity had lapsed, kedusha shelo kitchel lavo. If the ground was unconsecrated and you hold a Chaim Cohn that says the bummas were usher, how would you explain it? So I would suggest as follows: what exactly is the meaning of the prohibition of the bummas? What makes something a bumma? Is it the fact that the temple was unsanctified, as had been the case prior to Shlomo Melech? Or was it the fact that it wasn't on the site of the temple? So notice, is it chronological or physical geography? Right? What's the chisaron? So you could say Chaim Cohn holds it's geographic. That was the problem. There hadn't been a temple, and therefore all the offerings that were ever offered up, and begin wherever, were not on the right site. Accordingly, anything offered on the site of the temple, the site of the altar, is not a violation of Israel bones, regardless of whether or not the sanctity had lapsed. Accordingly, this is how they could do carbonos at the time of Zerubbabel before the consecration, and that's how they do carbonos to provide loaves for the ceremony in Nehemiah. At least that's what I think. So, to conclude, the takeaway from all of this is that this siyum is by definition a zecher b'alma. My mother lived a life of sacrifice. That's the carbonos, and was a member of a generation that brought many carbonos. And for all this, we're going to say Toda by eating 40 bagels.